And the last presentation I did in November was an overview of my thesis research. And that presentation had 60 slides in it. Just a tremendous amount of information. And I think people kind of went out of it sort of reeling, because a lot of what I introduce is stuff that you haven't thought about or read about. So it's just a lot to assimilate. So when I was working on putting together this presentation, I realized that my regular approach and how I usually do things wasn't working, because I just had too much information in my head. And so what I decided to do was minimize the slides. So I only have 25 slides, and there's not a lot of information on them. What I want to do is make this more of a conversation, and give you the opportunity to ask questions, to weigh in, and to just let it kind of go wherever it wants and needs to, based on what you want to know. I brought one tuning fork in case we need to do a little demonstration at any point. Although my talk tonight isn't really so much about sound as it is paradigms and cosmology and sort of the bigger picture. So that's me. Oh, and so I don't forget, I wanted to share with you at the very beginning that I'm going to be teaching a class here in the fall, a one-credit course on sound healing. And that's the information on it if you want to sign up for it. So the thesis research I did was called Exploring the Effects of Audible Sound on the Body and its Biofield. And what I did was that I hooked up a microphone to my tuning fork. I use tuning forks. That's my practice. I started using tuning forks in my massage therapy practice about 16 years ago, and was really sort of stunned to discover that they produced outcomes for people, that they diminished pain, that they diminished anxiety, that they helped resolve conflict in people. And I'm very much an experimenter. Let me try this and see what happens. What's the outcome of, if I do it this way? And it ended up being fascinating, and I stuck with it, and I've been doing it for 16 years now. And one of the things that I encountered as a person who uses tuning forks was a lot of skepticism. I'd be in a cocktail party or something, people are like, so what do you do? And I'd be like, oh, I'm a sound healer who uses tuning forks. And what I discovered was that there was like this consistent ideological rejection of that in sort of mainstream-minded individuals. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't like being ideologically rejected, especially when I know it does cool things for people. So I felt like in order to take this practice that I had discovered and these outcomes and really be able to move it out into the world, that it would be helpful to have degrees. And so I decided to go to college and learn and then ultimately teach about sound. And that's what I've done. I've learned a whole bunch about it, and now I get to teach here, which is really exciting. So one of the things that I discovered is that when I approach someone with a tuning fork, especially if they have a lot of pain, for example, and I could start 4 or 5 feet away from them, that the tone changes. So I can actually go through somebody's body and find where they have pain based on the way the tone changes. And so, and I've actually discovered a NAP, the whole energy field around the body. Very fascinating, but that's a whole other topic. But what I wanted to do was figure out a way to objectify it more. This is a very subjective experience of me waving my tuning forks around and being like, oh yeah, you have pain here. So I wanted to figure out a way to make it visible. And so what I ended up doing was getting some volunteers and suspending a lapel mic over the end of my fork while I was going through people's energy fields, sending it into a software program that made it visible. And it's called a spectrogram rendering. When you hear a tuning fork, you hear what's called its fundamental tone, which is whatever hertz it's in. Let's say it's 100 hertz, but it also produces overtones. And so what I was able to do was render these tones visible. So you'd see the fundamental tone, and then you'd see what the overtones look like. And so it was a stab, it was a start at showing that the tones change when they're moved around the body. So that was what my research project was. And I asked people how they felt, how'd you feel when you came in, how'd you feel when you left, how'd you feel 3 days later. And one of the things that we noticed was people's, does anybody not know what a chakra is? Okay, basically, you have energy centers along your body. They're places where nerve clusters come from the spine and innervate the body. And so you have about 7 of them going up the body. But in subtle energy literature, esoteric literature, they talk about the subtle body. They're described as wheels, and they're shown as circles of color, the colors of the rainbow going up the body. It's the subtle energy anatomy, but it's like a higher harmonic or a higher frequency of the physical body. And so one of the things that I found is that if the energy in somebody's root chakra or the base of their spine is low, it often corresponds with having low physical energy. So I would start off, somebody would say, oh yeah, I have low physical energy, and the output on the spectrogram would be really weak, it would look kind of like that. And then what I would do, my practice involves combing through the field and getting through all the energy in the field and bringing it into center and midline. And then after I would do that, then we would look at, the tuning fork held over the chakra again, and it would look really strong and bright, and then the person would report that they had a lot more energy the next day. So that was kind of the data that I was able to get out of my research project. And then what I had to do is, in my literature review, just go around and find a whole bunch of information about sound and about the body's energy field. And what I found, and it's kind of an interesting thing to be in academia researching subjects that aren't really academic. So, the use of sound therapeutically, as I use it, single tones to treat pain, to treat anxiety, that sort of thing. When I'm looking in the literature, there was nothing. Like, I didn't find anything at all. And so I had to look to other things like therapeutic touch, which is a hands-on energy modality where practitioners, a lot of nurses do it, actually use their hands to find disturbances in the field and their hands to move stuck energy in the body's energy field. So I had to look to things like that. For a while I was searching human energy field in the databases and not turning up anything, and then I found the term biofield, which is like the scientific term that was chosen by a panel of NIH scientists to describe the energy field of the body. So I started searching that, and I started coming up with more. But what I discovered as I went along was that, the modality that I was using, the means that I was working, really wasn't supported by the paradigm that we live in. And it put me in kind of an interesting position in my research, trying to speak a language about what I'm finding and what I'm seeing and what I'm observing, realizing that it didn't really fit in the context of what's accepted knowledge. So that's been, it's considered unscientific or pseudoscience. And that's something that I encounter a lot. I've got some YouTube videos, and every once in a while, there ends up a comment on it, pseudoscientific load of crap. And I get all fired up and really determined to understand and explain the science of it and make it so that it's not pseudoscientific. But energy medicine in general, homeopathy, anything that has to do with vibrational medicine is generally considered pseudoscience, even though lots of studies have shown that it's effective. Okay, so this is a kind of exploration around that idea. So what I want to do is just go through each of the words, the terms that are in the title of my lecture, just so you know what I'm talking about when I say all that. So therapeutic sound treatments. Tuning forks have been used probably since the late 70s, therapeutically. The first way that they were used was with weighted forks like this. Weighted forks are designed to be used on the body. They're used on acupuncture points. A couple different schools have developed around that. So instead of needles, which are invasive and painful, using tuning forks instead. And they found that it produced the same kind of outcomes that using needles did. It's certainly a lot more pleasant to experience. Using tuning forks, like this, most people use them in the way that I started using them, just over the center of the body, over the chakras. A lot of this concept of kind of drawing out dissonance or congestion or that sort of thing. That's the way that I started about 5 or 6, 7 years ago or so. I accidentally discovered that there was information out here, and I started exploring that. And now my work involves working up to 5-6 feet off the body and combing in, finding areas where there's contraction. So what I've discovered, and this has really come to light over the last few months especially, when we're in a stressful situation, whether it's trauma, whether it's physical, mental, emotional trauma, we tend to stop breathing and go into resistance, okay? Now, when we're not breathing, we're not digesting and assimilating experience. We go into resistance around it. So you can have a traumatic experience and you can move away from it in time and space, but you don't necessarily resolve it, okay? And so what I find is that these traumas, to me, the field is like a record of everything that's ever happened to you. And these traumas actually get stored in your field, and they're places where the energy doesn't flow and move. And so the tuning forks almost act like a sonar. As they pass through, actually hit resistance. And I think my students can attest to that. Robin, you're a student. It's a fairly easy phenomenon. Kate is also a student. You know, you guys, you can feel the resistance, right?
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it's there. And 7 or 8 people, Ashley's also a student, can come in and we'll all find resistance in the same spot. You know, it's there. It's a real significant thing. Depending on where the resistance shows up in the field, depends on, you know, what it might be related to. Again, that's a whole other subject. We might get into that a bit more later. But so my basic process is going through and finding these areas of resistance, using the sound to kind of break them up and get the energy moving. Lithotripsy is a mainstream medicine practice that uses sound waves to break up kidney stones. So that's the physics of how sound acts on matter. It opens up space between molecules in the body and also in the field, and it gets things moving. That's the basic premise of my practice, is just breaking up resistance in the field. Anybody have any questions? As we go along, please feel free to ask questions. You don't have to stay until the end, so if anything pops up or any kind of question, feel free to go ahead and ask me. So the biofield is also called the human energy field. It's also called the aura. As far as science is concerned, you know, mainstream science, it doesn't exist, but they definitely, you know, your body is electric. We tend to think of our nervous system as being electric, but they've actually determined that even your connective tissue, your collagen, is a semiconductor. So really your whole body is electric. Your blood conducts an electric charge. You know, you're mostly water. That is, you know, carries electric charge. So you're really an electric being, an electromagnetic being. And we're not taught that, you know, we're taught to kind of think of ourselves in terms of being a chemical being, like a bag of meat and chemicals. And the whole sort of electromagnetic piece, we're not really educated about. So paradigm. So this is a definition of a paradigm. I really like this new paradigm again. You gotta love Google image search when you're putting together a PowerPoint presentation. A philosophical and theoretical framework of a scientific school or discipline within which theories, laws, and generalizations and the experiments performed in support of them are formulated. Broadly, a philosophical or theoretical framework of any kind. So we live within paradigms. We have a particular paradigm, like what I was talking about, you know, in terms of thinking ourselves as chemical beings. I mean, this whole sort of chemical medicine and meat machine, you know, that's the paradigm we live in. Whereas something with like an energy field and tuning forks does not fit in the paradigm. I don't call myself a sound healer anymore. I call myself a researcher who's been studying the effects of audible sound on the body. And nobody gives me a hard time about that. So the current paradigm we inhabit is the Newtonian mechanistic paradigm, where the existence of a biofield or bioenergetic field directly contradicts principles of physics, chemistry, and biology. Chemical medicine that has been double-blind tested is the only scientifically accepted or valid method of healing, and all forms of energy medicine are pseudoscience. Does everybody agree that that's kind of what we're taught and what you're, you know, approved? It's approved.
I mean, where does physical therapy fall in that?
Well, it's mechanistic. You know, you got this problem, do this exercise. So in order to talk about the emerging paradigm, I just came up with some quotes. In order to fully understand and advance energy medicine or healing, science will have to accept the currently taboo possibility that pervasive intelligence or consciousness exists throughout the universe. You know, this makes me think of this big aha moment that I had when I was doing my research and I pulled out some, articles off of PubMed and Medline, that sort of thing. And I came across a passage that said that the Eastern concept of chi or prana, which is a subtle energy which makes up the body's energy field, that the translation of that, okay, the Western translation of that, does anybody know what the translation is? It's breath. It's breath. It's also spirit or Holy Spirit. Okay? And therein lies the problem, because we've been raised in this culture that separates religion and science. And so anything that gets translated as spirit isn't any place that a hard scientist is going to go. There's a line in the sand. There's a line in the sand. And so even though it's a scientific phenomenon that should be defined scientifically, there's this sort of perception of subtle energy as chi as religious. And that is, to me, is like the biggest reason why we don't go there scientifically. Isn't that interesting? Like, it's sort of obvious when you think about it, but I had never really realized it until I saw it in black and white on the paper. This quote got me really excited when I saw this movie, The Living Matrix. Has anybody seen that movie yet? This is a great movie, and it's one of those talking heads movies, like What the Bleep Do We Know and that sort of thing. But they have all these people on there, and they're talking about energy medicine, biofield, and scientists, and they really frame it, I think, very well. But anyway, towards the end of it, Lynn McTaggart, who wrote a book called The Field, says informational medicine that changes disturbed information available in the biofield is going to be the future of medicine. And I got so excited when I saw that. I was like, that's what I do. Because it's really what it's about. The field is, in my opinion, the field is primary. It surrounds, it interpenetrates the body. Disturbances develop first in the field and then work their way into the body. So if we correct things in the field first before they go into the body, then we don't end up dealing with the random disease that we are. So, and then this quote, which seems odd that he would have said it, but I've come across it numerous times, where Albert Einstein says, "Vibration trumps chemistry." So, these are all what more forward-thinking people are talking about as far as this emerging paradigm of recognizing that consciousness is pervasive. That, in Eastern medicine, the concept of chi involves consciousness. That the chi, the subtle energy, is mind and consciousness. It's not just what happens in the brain. Okay, wellness. The standard definition of health, in Western medicine, is the absence of disease. Like, no wonder why everybody's sick. What a lame definition. One of the definitions of health that I've come across that I really like, so simple, is freedom. And you think about that. I mean, you think about all the ways in which we can become bound and how that takes away from our health and our well-being. Whether you're in pain or financial stress or emotional stress, whatever. But if you're free from all that, then you're healthy. Basically, non-beneficial frequencies in our environment is what stresses our organism. And if you're free from all of that noise, then you're going to flourish. You're just going to be naturally well. I like this, I don't know if anybody's ever done, there's an exercise you do with the wheel of balance, where you kind of go through and you go, okay, well, my intellectual wellness is up here, my physical wellness is down here, my social wellness, my financial is up here. And if things aren't balanced, then your wheel is bumpy, your ride is bumpy. Whereas if you have sort of a balance of taking into account all of that, then you have true wellness. Or if you're free, in all of these places, then you really got health. It's not just the absence of disease. Physics. Okay. Physics is the branch of science that's concerned with the nature and properties of matter and energy, the physical properties and the phenomena of something, the physics of plasma. So, a straightforward definition of physics. The old physics, the one that we all learned in school, I heard this, as I'm learning all of this, of course, my perspective is really changing, and I was at an open house. My son was in, I think, 3rd grade, and they were teaching him that the smallest unit of matter was an atom. And I was like, what are you doing teaching them that the smallest unit of matter is an atom? Like, that's not even true. you're indoctrinating them into this like belief that there's all these little bits of stuff interacting with other bits of stuff. And you know, and even if you believe that there's really truly stuff there, then it isn't even an atom that's the smallest bit. And the teacher's response was, well, you know, they'll learn that at the higher level. Well, you know what? How many people study physics in college? You know, most ordinary people go into the world, you know, thinking that the smallest unit of matter is an atom and there's stuff there. And that's what they believe. That's what we all believe. There was also, you know, this belief that we could objectively observe the world outside of ourselves, that it could be objectively observed. You know, one of the things that they discovered in quantum physics is that you can't really separate the observer from the observed, and what you expect to happen ends up influencing what really happens. You know, so the sort of notion that there's stuff that has a little independent life outside of us, the observer, you know, has also been shown to not be true. And this is a slide I put in every one of my presentations because I'm just so appalled by it. Max Planck received the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1918, and he said, "We have now discovered that there is no such thing as matter. It's all just different rates of vibration designed by an unseen intelligence." That was almost 100 years ago. And my kids are still being told their stuff. Very interesting. You know, so the quantum physicists, you know, they all know that everything's in this vibrating world of potentiality. The rest of us are living in a mechanical universe still. Okay, cosmology. This is one of my favorite topics. Cosmology has a few different definitions. So there's like a metaphysical definition that deals with sort of the nature of the universe and our place in it as human beings. A theory or doctrine describing the natural order, or a branch of astronomy that deals with the origin, structure, and space-time relationships of the universe. So, you know, this part of cosmology is figuring out how old the universe is and what the rate of expansion that it is, and you know, that sort of thing. I like, you know, I have kind of a metaphysical bent to me, so I like that definition. So when I'm talking about cosmology, I'm more inclined to talk about that, although I do talk about that a bit as well. So why does cosmology matter? When I was in David's class, Ed Research, I think it was, we had to do a report on some aspect of the educational system. And you know, some people did No Child Left Behind and this, that, and the other, but I decided to take a step back and look at all the assumptions, look at the cosmology or the bigger picture that it all fits inside. So, you know, our assumptions about the nature of reality and the universe, and they inform all the sciences, they inform everything. And there are all these underlying assumptions that we don't really talk about so much, they're just kind of there, understood, or sort of subtly programmed into us. Every human discipline is influenced by our governing cosmology, our creation story. The tribe gets bonded together by its creation story. You know, like the Democrats tend to be more Darwinist and evolutionists, whereas I'm speaking very broadly here, the Republicans tend to be more like creationists, the different creation stories, different cosmologies. So it really sets the stage that the human drama is played out on. That's a little cartoon. Just trying to understand humans and our place in it. You know, maybe we don't, in the grand scheme of things, we might not know much more now, really, than we did thousands or millions of years ago. The cosmology that we've all grown up with is Big Bang Theory. You know, unless you grew up, well, there's two. I mean, one is the creationism, if you come from a Christian or religious background. But the one that we were all fed in school is Big Bang Theory. And basically it says that the universe started and it was infinitely tiny and infinitely hot, infinitely dense, and then it exploded and it's been expanding ever since. This, what's called a standard model, looks at space and says that gravity is the dominant force in space. And I don't know how much you know about this, but you know, we've all been taught about black holes, dark energy, dark matter. Those are all mathematical constructs that are created to balance out gravity. Because what they found is that there isn't enough gravity inside a galaxy to account for it hanging together. okay? So there has to be a black hole in the middle that has all this gravity to it. And then there has to be all this dark energy and dark matter to like kind of push things from the outside, okay? So they've never observed dark energy, they've never observed dark matter, they never even observed black holes. And if you ever look at an artist's rendition of a black hole, it's not black, it's full of light. Has anybody ever noticed that? It's like, doesn't make any sense. It sucks in everything, sucks in light. But when you see them, they're just, whoa, really full of light. So I don't get that. We've been taught that the sun is, that the sun and all the stars are isolated bodies in the sky, and that it's a nuclear furnace and it's burning itself out. That, you know, I was taught that there was a vacuum, like it was all just cold, empty nothingness in between. Right? Does everybody kind of agree that that was your perception of it? And that it's all moving towards this thermal dissolution where it's all going to spread out and heat and die, and it's all just going to spread out, and that's going to be the end of it. So that's the cosmology that I was raised with, and you know, that most people tend to believe in. But while I was doing research for this, I came across a completely wild thing that I absolutely didn't expect. And you know, I've been, ever since I was like 17 or 18, I suffered from depression as a kid, I suffered from an eating disorder as a teenager. You know, I was a really messed up American teenage girl. Like most American teenage girls are. Our culture is very damaging. And I started reading books in an effort to understand why I felt so bad and maybe try to figure out how to help myself to feel better. And so, you know, I read about science and spirituality, I read self-help books, really pretty much read nonstop, you know, all kinds of human potential books, and really looking for answers, and nothing ever satisfied me and gave me the answers I was looking for until I discovered electric universe theory, which was like a huge aha, because it gave me a new cosmology. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So, electric universe theory, and the way this happened, it's kind of a funny story how it happened. Quinn, my son over there, for his 12th birthday, I gave him a couple books that a friend of mine had been moving, and Quinn likes science, and she was getting rid of books, and she gave me a couple books on science because she knew that Quinn liked science. So for his 12th birthday, I gave him these books. And he, you know, he read them, and he came to the dinner table one night, and he said, "Did you know that there's a fourth state of matter called plasma?" And I was like, huh. No, you know, somehow I missed that one because I learned about solids and liquids and gases, but no one ever told me about plasma. And I didn't even really know about it. I kind of heard of plasma TVs. So in the same conversation, we were talking about space being a vacuum. And I was like, you know, I think I read somewhere where space isn't really a vacuum. My husband's like, what are you talking about? Of course it's a vacuum. So I went and I Googled, space is not a vacuum. And what did I find that space is filled with, according to some people? But plasma. I was like, wasn't that funny? There's plasma. So anyway, I fell down the plasma rabbit hole. And I spent 5 months reading everything I could about plasma. I mean, I just read. And after a little while, my husband was like, you don't love me. You love plasma. And I was like, I do. I was like going to bed at night dreaming of plasma, waking up like, really, I got really into plasma. I still am. So anyway, electric universe, basically what it says is that electricity, not gravity, is the dominant force in space, okay? And electricity is way more powerful than gravity by like an order of 49 magnitude or something like that. It's a very, very big, because basically the standard model says electricity is neutral in space and therefore it cancels out and it plays no part. So, you know, if you have any interest in this, I really suggest looking it up. And there's one website, I'll write it down for you, it's called thunderbolts.info, and they have a slideshow that kind of explains it. Anyway, as I'm reading it, I'm getting my hands on everything that I can about it. It's like so logical, it just makes so much sense. And basically what it says is that you know, the sun isn't this poor little isolated thermonuclear furnace burning itself out. It's electric. And not only is it electric, but it's connected to all the other stars in the universe by these electrical currents. They're like Christmas lights on a wire. These are called Birkeland currents. They connect all the stars. And they power all the stars. And even in between, you know, even in the space in between, there's really diffuse plasma. Plasma is basically a gas that carries an electric current. So like a neon light is the gas, it's sitting there, and then when you run the electricity through it, it lights up. So when you see like northern lights, that's our ionosphere, which is plasma. But when we get a coronal mass ejection from the sun, and a lot of those have been happening lately. I don't know if anybody's paying attention to that, but we've been getting these, you know, X-class flares and that sort of thing. So when we get more electric current from the sun, you know, they talk about the solar wind and hot gas, and like even NASA doesn't even use the right terminology. It's plasma, it's electricity that's coming from the sun. Does everybody get, did you know that was all electricity coming from the sun? We kind of, it doesn't really say that, but that's what it is, okay? And so this extra current comes in and it hits our upper atmosphere and it lights it up. There's more current, the more it glows. So it follows predictable patterns and it's got scalable behavior. So how plasma behaves in a lab is the same way it behaves in space. There's this great book called The Electric Sky by a guy named Donald Scott, who he was a professor of electrical things, I don't know exactly how to say that, and an amateur astronomer. And he had such a great intimate knowledge about electricity and really loved space. And what he started to notice was like what the cosmologists were saying about what was going on in space was like, didn't make any sense to him. He started really investigating it and doing his research and you know, has become a main proponent and describer of how this whole electric universe theory works. So here you have this whole electrical connected space, okay? And then you have your electric body. And when I realized that I was electric and that space was electric and that it was all connected in this sort of plasmic medium, I was like, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for my whole life. Because our culture makes us feel alone, isolated, you know, cold, you know, depressed. You think about black holes. I mean, it's a very, I don't know, it's a very uncomfortable and unpleasant cosmology that we live in. And when you really get the whole electric piece, it's like warm and fuzzy, at least to my mind. So anyway, what's interesting is that, you know, any place where you've got a kind of a standard model, you have the defenders of the standard model, okay? You know, people who have their whole careers invested in a particular thing. And so EU is definitely growing, you know. What's really neat is that you always see in press releases about how astronomers are mystified or confused by the behavior of certain phenomena in space. The EU people describe it perfectly, like they're never confused because their assumption, their paradigm, the lens that they're viewing it through is just it's more real about what's going on. But you know, NASA isn't really opening to it, and certainly like the educational system isn't yet. But I'm quite confident because it is so logical and because it makes so much sense and because it makes you feel good that it's definitely going to start to disperse. So that's one of the new paradigms that's ahead. Yes?
I mean, I don't know what scalable behavior means.
Scalable behavior means the way, if you're working with plasma in the laboratory, on a very small level, it will behave the exact same way that it behaves in space. Okay, so dynamic exchange of energy, entropy is not inevitable. So the second law of thermodynamics says that that the universe is going to wind down into this, you know, heat death. It's all going to fall apart and spread out. Okay. A Russian scientist back in the 40s, this guy named Kozyrev, he observed that wasn't really happening. You know, that yeah, you know, stars die, but then new stars are born. So that if order and structure is lost in one place, it kind of arises someplace else. And I like this symbol that kind of describes that. It's like, okay, yeah, it's going down, but oh, look, it's coming up over here. And so the universe is kind of like a self-perpetuating, what's the kind of machine that runs by itself that you can't ever patent because that doesn't exist? What the heck's it called?
Perpetual motion.
Perpetual motion. Yeah, the universe is in perpetual motion. And any place that loses energy here or loses order here, then it will arise over here. So that's what's going on. It isn't doing that. Um, so Buckminster Fuller was a really brilliant guy. He was a Renaissance man and is really involved in a lot of different disciplines. But he made the observation that the physical is inherently entropic, and entropy is the tendency of a system to lose order, basically. You know, they put logs in the fireplace and they lose their structure order, you know, and they turn them down into ash. So that's an entropic process. A tree falls over in the woods and it, you know, dissipates. So it gives off energy in ever more disorderly ways. The metaphysical is anti-entropic, methodically marshalling energy. Life is anti-entropic. So what he's talking about is that there's this other force, there's this life force that arises and gives order to things, okay? Now, he uses the word anti-entropic. So here you have the most magnificent force in the universe, that which creates things, that which gives rise to life, that which creates galaxies and snails and us, right? Do you know what science calls it? Do you know what the standard accepted term for this force is? Does anybody know? It's negative entropy. I mean, what does that tell you about the way we look at things? Negative entropy. It's like, that's horrible. I hate that. So I went to a conference back in October, this conference called the Bioenergetic Conference. And the reason I went is because there were a number of speakers there whose books I had been reading for my thesis. And I was like, I want to go hang with these people because they speak my language. So the first day that I was there, I ended up having lunch with the fellow who wrote this book called Life Force, The Scientific Basis. This fellow is an MIT and Princeton educated physicist who started to take an interest in subtle energy and the life force, even though you don't talk about it at MIT or Princeton, and did his own independent research into it and self-published this book. And then there was another speaker as well who also talks about similar things like this. Anyway, the very first day of the conference, I ended up having lunch with both of them. And I was going through my notebook, because I had all these questions, and I'm going through and like, oh, okay, let's ask this question, and this question needs answering it for me. And then I've written in really big letters, we need a better word than negative entropy. And the other fellow, the second one I was describing, he said, oh yeah, there is another word, and it's called syntropy. And it's like, oh, thank God, that's the one I'm going to use, so that's a much better word. So I've taken that into use. And syntropy just basically describes, the upswing of it all. That, the subtle energy and how it gives rise to that. But what does it say about our culture that we're kind of in denial of that? And, and the subtle is also more the feminine, whereas the gross is more the masculine. When you think about how we're it's all men that are thinking about this, and so there's sort of this denial of the life force, of the subtle energy, of the feminine, of the magnetic. Any questions? Okay, so basically one of the ways that these different ways of looking at things is framed is in this, the mechanists versus the vitalists. And, some sources say that it's a 300 or 400-year-old struggle. Some say it's been going on for 2,500 years. I put in this picture because you can see it a couple different ways, right? And it isn't really either or, it's kind of both, right? Depending on how you look at it. And so that's my perspective on the mechanists versus the vitalists. It really isn't either or, it's both, depending on how you look at it. But the mechanists trump. Mechanists, right now, chemistry trumps vibration in our paradigm, not the other way around. In my mind, there's so many studies that show the efficacy of energy medicine, and as we'll talk about later, there have been plenty of people who've been researching this, both in and out of academia, for over 100 years. But it's all kind of brushed under the rug and put away and discounted, and really, actually kind of bullied. I've found that the people who are defenders of the mechanistic model are bullies, and they like to give a really hard time to people who don't toe their line. And I've certainly been victim of it myself. I've been bullied by people. You know, whereas the EU people, if you go on any science forum on the internet, people are mean to each other. If you go onto the EU forum, people are really kind. So, you know, to me, based on all the information that's out there and based on the logic of it all, it seems like this revolution has been really slow in coming. You know, it's like all this information is there. You know, you think about what Planck said 100 years ago. It's like, God, why haven't we gotten this yet? Okay, so this is plagiarized from somewhere, and I forget where. But I did lift this off of somebody. They were talking about, these are the 10 tenets of the mechanistic worldview. So this is, you know, the sort of assumptions. That everything is essentially mechanical and physical. All matter is unconscious. The total amount of matter and energy is always the same. The laws of nature are fixed. Nature is purposeless, and evolution has no goal or direction. It's all chaos, random chaos. Okay? A cold, empty space. I like this because we're also taught that, you know, like we're prisoners of our DNA. A friend of mine told this story about her dad was dying of cancer, and she'd gone to stay with him, and her stepmom was preparing a meal for him, and she was microwaving it with plastic wrap on it. And my friend is a real kind of health nut. She's like, oh God, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not good for him. And the stepmother was like, oh, it's all the DNA, you know, it's all in his genes. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. So we're like prisoners of our DNA. It's very fixed, very rigid. I know, I was like, don't use microwaves, people. They're really not good for you, especially with plastic. So all biological inheritance is material. It's carried in the genetic DNA. It's chemical, right? Our minds are inside our heads. They're nothing but the activity of your brain. Any thought you have, any feeling, any you know, perception. It's all happening just in your brain. That's the only place it's taking place. And your memories are stored in material traces in your brain, and then they're wiped out at death. And when you die, that's it. You just decompose, and that's the end of you. Unexplained phenomena like telepathy are illusory. I remember coming across, and this was years ago, that some professor at Harvard had declared that there was no such thing as miracles. You know, I traveled around the world by myself when I was a teenager, and I'll tell you what, miracles happen all the time when you live out on the edge. I mean, all the time, right? You know, you hitchhike, right? I mean, I think about this person living his little tiny self-important life, moving in the same little tiny prescribed circle. There was no room for miracles in his life. But if you're out at the edge and you're living a creative life, miracles happen constantly. Synchronicity happens all the time. It's just, it all depends on your worldview. But this man in his ivory tower, you know, kind of declared to everyone that there was no such thing as miracles. And that there's no such thing as telepathy, or that there's no such thing as distance healing or any of these things. You know, that's all like woo-woo. And then, of course, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Chemical medicine is the only thing that's valid. And if you choose for yourself or your children to try anything different, then you are being irresponsible. So these I made up. And, you know, there might be people who argue with it, but this is just my perspective. That everything is essentially frequency or energy. You know, the notion of stuff, and this is a little information bite I came across a couple days ago. I don't know if it's true, but it's probably somewhere in the realm of truth, is that we're continually exposed to something like 40 million bytes of information in any given second, and that our nervous system can only process 40 bytes per second. Okay? So what that means is that everything is moving really fast, but our nervous system slows it way down and turns it into these very digestible bytes. Okay? So even though, you know, according to this theory, this table is all just vibration, it's all just patterns of energy and information, because my nervous system is moving at the pace it's at, the way that I interface with it is that it appears solid. Okay? Now there are people who are mystics, you know, who can have knives stuck into them and pulled out and they heal right away. So on some level of consciousness or awareness, when you really get that it's all just vibration, there's a way to interface with that so that you don't succumb to the law, what we know as the laws of the physical universe. Is everybody with me on that? Okay. All of creation is conscious or has varying degrees of consciousness. So I probably have a little bit more consciousness than a rock. I'd like to think I do. I might not. There might be people who would argue with me and say that rock is just as conscious as you are, and except it's not conscious with words, like you're conscious with words. That the total amount of energy may be in flux. That's a subject I don't want to get into, but that's something that I've definitely read. The laws of nature may be evolving, but they might not be fixed, but they might be evolving, like the universe, like us, like life. The nature arises in patterns with intention. So one of the independent studies that I did was on sacred geometry. And sacred geometry, my degree, because I'm not getting licensure, I was kind of free to create my own degree, and we call it independent track in the master's program. And I was like, I want to do a degree in integrative education. I want to look at that which connects the disciplines. Because when you get into higher education, everybody goes off into their own departments and nobody talks to each other. You know, I mean, this is like if the electrical engineers were talking to astrophysicists, you know, you might have a little bit more collusion about realizing that electric universe theory makes a lot more sense. But anyway, so I'm interested in like, well, what connects everything, okay? And one of the things that connects everything is this concept of sacred geometry, and that is that nature arises in very set and pretty simple patterns. That the vacuum or the fundamental ground state of being composes itself in different patterns, like the platonic solids, or like the shape of a toroid or helix. So there are certain patterns within the potentiality that the matter adheres to and rises in shape around. And so when I learned about sacred geometry, now I don't know about you guys, but I hated math when I was a kid. Like I hated math. I hated math and I hated biology, okay? And I didn't realize until I started learning about sacred geometry that the soul of math had been taken out. The connectivity, the underlying pattern has been removed. I mean, that's what this whole mechanistic thing is about, right? We're all taught science. What have we taken out? We've taken out the spirit. We've taken out the soul. We've taken out the connectivity, the underlying pattern, that which glues it all together, okay? And when I was learning about sacred geometry, I'm like, why didn't they teach me this in school? Because I would have loved math. I would have loved it. And I didn't realize at the time I hated it because it was dry. It was like toast. And same with biology. You know, I didn't want to dissect dead frogs. You know, I wanted to understand how life arose. And even when I took biology here, my biology teacher said, you know, kind of at the beginning of class, he's like, yes, the earth is not living. You know, we as biologists believe that the earth is not alive. He said, the earth supports life, but the earth is not living. And I was like, ah! You've taken the soul away from the earth and the fact, you know, it's like, and so this whole notion, when you take the soul away from everything, you take the consciousness of everything, what can you do? You have dominion over it. You can use it, you can abuse it, you can break it, you can, you know, it's all okay to do all that. And you're not connected to it. Your stuff's separate from that stuff, so it doesn't matter what you do to that stuff. It's not going to affect you. So these patterns, I mean, you see the double helix pattern from the smallest level, the Birkeland currents that I talked about earlier. They move through space in this helical pattern, positive and negative charges, spiral helically around each other. You know, DNA is helical, kind of everything in between. Things move in these helical structures. Biological inheritance is vibrational patterning. It's like music. And it can actually be shifted with ease. You can change your DNA with thoughts. It's very mutable. It's not fixed. It's much more like a vibrational pattern. You know, for me as a sound therapist working with vibration, I see how our parents' vibrational information lives in us. Yeah, you have inherited their blood, you have inherited their DNA, but you've also inherited their vibrational patterning. And that can be shifted even in your body with sound. Minds are the field that surrounds and interpenetrates the body and are the precursors to bodies. So some of the scientific researchers who've been studying fields have found that the field, arises first, and that the body arises within it, and that the blueprint of the body is within the field. The field is there first and gives rise to the body. Unlike the mechanistic model, which says if there are fields, they are secondary to the physical body. In my work, I definitely believe that the field is the mind. The body, they'll feel everything, it's all your mind. It's not just happening here. And that all your memories are imprinted in this field. And that, then this is kind of going to the realm of religion, and I don't really like to go there too much, but I really do believe, again, just based on my own work, my own observations, that the field doesn't die, that it goes on, and that it carries the information that it's accumulated from lifetime to lifetime. Some people are just old souls and they seem like they have so much knowledge, and you're like, how did you ever come up with that? And it's like, well, because I've been learning for many lifetimes and I've been storing it all, because it doesn't go away. Unexplained phenomena like telepathy are based on the fact that there is an underlying field that connects us all, and it connects us instantly. I mean, how many of you guys know when your husband or your boyfriend or your wife is like texting you even though you're ringers? You know what I mean? Like, you just know. How do you know? Because you're connected. It's just that there's that underlying field that's there. One of the other things that's really a key part in energy healing is intention. And that's one of those kind of new agey words, we're to set the intention to do this, that, or the other. But I was thinking about, have you ever walked down a crowded street or in a crowded airport? Like, how do you not run into each other? On some level, you're sensing people's intention about where they're going, right? How are you sensing that? Are you seeing it? Maybe not. Now, I like to tell this story about intention. I was at a Pink Floyd concert at Foxborough Stadium years ago. And, you can imagine a Pink Floyd concert, like people are drunk or stoned or tripping or God knows what, all kinds of people there. And it was halftime, and there were literally like tens of thousands of people milling around in the horseshoe that surrounded the stadium. I was with my boyfriend and his brother and his brother's friend, and we had lost his brother and we were trying to find him. His brother was wearing this really big neon green clown wig. And way far away from here to the parking lot, I see the clown wig, and I was like, there he is. And so I looked at that clown wig and I just set off through these people. Now all these people, the lighting's not that great and they're in all different forms of awareness, right? I just kept my eye on that wig and I cut through the crowd. And then it's really like, everybody's like, really close like this. And I just went for it. And I got there and turned around, my boyfriend's breathless behind me. He's like, you just parted the Red Sea. And I was like, I just had very clear intentions. And nobody got in my way. I mean, even people who weren't facing me felt my very clear intention and moved out of my way. I didn't bump up against anybody. So how are people sensing that? They're sensing that with their field. They're sensing my field, with their feeling. Oh, this woman knows where she's going. I better move, right? I better adapt to that. So, when people try to take this whole concept of intention and make it like some kind of new age, it's not. We all sense people's intention all the time. I have a client whose daughter is, she's 16 or 17 now. She does this camp in Montpelier where one of the things they do is they make these kids walk blindfolded through the woods, and they have to be able to sense whether somebody's hiding and whether they're sending evil intentions or good intentions. And through this, they're blindfolded, and they develop heightened senses. Sounds like something you should do, Andrew. About being able to really sense these vibrations traveling through the air and picking them up, with your field and with your body. Okay, and vibrational medicine works by correcting scrambled information in the field. So homeopathy, is helping your body to sort out how to deal with certain vibrations. Certainly sound work. Any kind of energy work is supporting your energy and resolving into coherence, into clarity, getting the static out of the signal, getting rid of the noise. I got this slide because this is this is sort of an interesting turning point, and to my mind, kind of a defining moment in the mechanistic paradigm that we're in. Antoine Mesmer was a physician in Europe. He practiced in both Italy and France. in the late 1700s. And he started he started to perceive that our bodies are surrounded by and interpenetrated with an invisible fluid. He called it ether, okay? And he found that ether was affected by magnets and stars and planetary bodies, and even by his hands, that he could actually move the ether around with his hands. And he found that disruption of the flow of this fluid results in sickness. He used iron rods and magnets to realign the magnetic fields in the body, which he believed aided in the fluid, the flow of it. Well, that's exactly what I do at Team Force. You know, I perceive the field around the body as sort of a magnetic fluid. There's places where I get stuck, I break it up and get it moving, I align it all to midline. Same thing that he was doing. Because it is there. There's an objective that it's there. And what ended up happening was, apparently he was a very flamboyant character, and some I think the king of France got upset with him for some reason or other. Anyway, he ended up being brought before a panel of scientists, and this was in the late 1700s, that included Ben Franklin. And this panel of scientists concluded that it was all figment of his imagination. They said, "You're full of it. This is BS. There's no such thing as this, and you're not allowed to practice medicine anymore." And he went off and lived the rest of his life in obscurity somewhere. And so that was kind of like, you know, this is the final word. There is none of this silly vibrational stuff, and we're going to look at it all from a mechanistic perspective. And, we've been doing that. What was that, like 1800? And this is, 2012. And you look at all the information that's been available, like especially, they said from 2003 to now, there's more information available to us than there was in the whole rest of the history of the world in these 8 years. Millions of years or tens of thousands of years of human history, more information in the last 8 years, okay? So, does it make any sense to be adhering to theories that arose 300 years ago, or longer, when there's so much information to the contrary? It's a great time to be a researcher. I mean, I love researching, and I'm so thrilled and delighted to have the internet and have all of this information at my fingertips. It's just so much fun. Other people have studied this. There's a fellow named Harold Saxton Burr, and he was a professor of, I can't remember if he was a professor of anatomy, I think, at Yale, and from 1930 to 1970, and especially in the 40s and 50s, he got really into studying what he called L fields, the life fields that surrounded things. And he had like mirrors attached to trees, and he was really into it. And he same thing, disturbances in the field show that there's going to be a pathology that's going to arise in the body. And did a lot of studies, a lot of research, well respected, okay? But in the 50s, this was when this whole concept of like a pill for every problem was kind of being advanced, and his perspective and his studies and what way he was espousing was going directly against the current of the time. With all the success with penicillin and that sort of thing, there was a real push to reduce everything to its chemical nature. And so, have you ever heard of him? No, I hadn't heard of him. And, it was only something I came across after digging deeply in research. But this esteemed Yale professor espoused and described the light fields that surrounded him. Wilhelm Reich, he wasn't really academic, but he was working with subtle energy. He called it orgone. And, built these orgone or subtle energy accumulators, and really did a lot of work to understand subtle energy and how it works. I've come to see subtle energy, or chi, as what I call a diffuse magnetism. It's kind of like electromagnetism, but it's a higher harmonic of it. And it vibrates at a much higher frequency, and it's more diffuse. So that's what my perception of subtle energy is after all the research that I've done. It's like a magnetic fluid. And anyway, Reich was really persecuted. Now, I don't know if you know about his history, but he was really, I think he ended up in jail, honestly, and his stuff was burned, and he was branded as disreputable. This guy, Royal Raymond Wright, brilliant guy, he developed a high-powered microscope that could look at microorganisms without having to stain them and thus kill them. So you could actually see like viruses and things like that that were living. It was a very complex microscope. It had thousands of moving pieces and crystals and all kinds of stuff. And he developed a method to match the frequency of a virus or a cancer cell and amplify it. What he called its mortal oscillatory rate. So you know how you can shatter a wine glass when singing? You see the Mythbusters? Actually, I think they had to do it through a speaker. But I think that there are people who can do it just with their voice. And one of the things they do to start is they find the tone that it makes, and then they match that tone, they amplify that tone, and then it can't maintain its structural integrity anymore, and it shatters, okay? So this is what Reif figured out. He figured this out in the 20s and the 30s, how to shatter the cell membranes of viruses, of cancer cells. He successfully treated all kinds of diseases using this method. And what he would do is he would send the vibrations through a plasma tube into specific areas of the body, like the cancerous growth here. He would set his machine to the right frequency for that kind of cancer cell, send that frequency through a plasma tube into the body, and it would go, and it would it would isolate it and direct it, and then that it would be on, and it didn't damage the tissue around it or anything like that. And what ended up happening to him was the guy who was head of the American Medical Association at the time went on like this personal campaign to discredit him, to discredit the people who worked with him. They burned down his lab, they destroyed his papers, and kept bringing him to court. Here's this poor guy who's just like wants to end suffering in the world, wants to, he's a gentle, dedicated scientist. And he ended up becoming an alcoholic, and everything got scattered in the wind, and then that was that. Now, think about all the people who've been tortured by chemotherapy, by surgeries, by drugs since the 20s, since the 30s, when he was doing this. Can you imagine what a different world it would be if we were using frequencies to treat people all these years? Valerie Hunt she was a professor at UCLA. And she's been studying the human energy field. She's come up with what she calls an aura meter. She found that, one of the things people like to say is, oh, well, the human energy field hasn't been measured. That's not true. It's not true. Just like they say, homeopathy and acupuncture, that's like unscientific medicine hasn't been proven. That's not true either. I mean, there's lots of studies out there that just demonstrate the efficacy of this stuff. Lots of them. They're just not published by the Journal of American Medicine. One of the stories I like to tell is about how a 9-year-old girl named Emily Rosa in the mid-90s came up with a study for her science fair to test practitioners of therapeutic touch, okay, who purport to be able to feel your field with their hands. She wanted to know if they really could. So she set up this blind, with holes that she could stick through, and she put her hands up there, and the practitioners had to determine whether her hands were present or not. And what ended up happening is in 240 trials, these practitioners were only successful 44% of the time, okay? So it turns out that Emily's parents were very mechanistic people and very opposed to alternative medicine. And they were friends with this guy named Stephen Barrett, who has a website called Quack Watch, where he goes through and systematically bashes every single alternative medicine and demonstrates why they are, disreputable, why you are irresponsible if you choose to use them. So Stephen Barrett helped Emily and her parents write this study up, and they submitted it to the Journal of American Medicine, who published it, okay? Now, prior to this guy named Gary Schwartz, who is a professor at the University of Arizona, received thousands of dollars, tens of hundreds, I don't know, a lot of money from the National Institute of Health to study alternative medicine. And he did all kinds of very rigorously controlled studies, done by a professor with an NIH grant that demonstrated that even college students could feel things like this. That demonstrated that Reiki was effective in streptococcal bacteria and lab mice, okay? Gary Schwartz wrote up all these studies and submitted them to the Journal of American Medicine, and they didn't publish his stuff. They published a 9-year-old girl's science fair study. which was then picked up by Time magazine and the popular media, and then given to the world as demonstration that this energy medicine is bunk. That's not scientific. You know, that's bias. That's ridiculous. So, anyway, so that's why, why people believe that this stuff isn't real or isn't scientific based. Just because it's not in Time magazine. It's not Newsweek. Who's the biggest advertiser in Time magazine? Anybody know?
Drugs.
Drug companies. They don't want you knowing about the effectiveness of vibrational medicine. So Valerie Hunt, what she did was she figured out that the frequencies of the field are way, way higher, like way higher than the physical body. And she was actually able to measure them. So her work is a good demonstration of that. William Tiller is a professor at Stanford who is a materials professor and all about trying to understand stuff. And what he discovered in all of his experiments was that the intention, the expectation of the studier affected the outcome of experiments. So then he started studying intention. And he's done a whole great body of work on how intention, subtle energy, thought, belief affects what happens out there. Rupert Sheldrake is a guy who coined the term morphinogenic fields. And basically he believes that all these fields exist, like, for any given species, they all have their own field, and that the information in the field is shared. He's a chemist, a highly educated person, draws a lot of fire as being, out there. But he's really launched a full frontal attack at the moment. He's wrote a book called The Science Delusion. He basically talks about, all these mechanistic tenets, and it's like a religion. And we're so stuck adhering to this unwillingness to consider spirit. That line in the sand is really hobbling science. It's stopping science from being able to really move forward. So he's done a lot of work to just validate and describe that. But he's seen as a kook. And Robert O. Becker, he was a scientist who discovered that acupuncture points have a different electrical resistance than the rest of the body, among other things. He really did a lot of exploration into the electric nature of the body. So there have been, in the last 100 years, and this is just some of them, some of the ones that are better known. There have been scientists, there have been studies, there have been demonstrations. It just hasn't been brought to your awareness. Okay, somebody posted this on Facebook today, and I thought, that kind of fits. This is really, in my mind, what it comes down to. Because as long as you believe that you're isolated, that you're separate, that you're broken, you're gonna look outside yourself to be fixed, and talking about why Harold Saxton Burr didn't really go anywhere. Because of that time, where was the money? There's money to be made in chemical medicine. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a sick amount of money to be made in chemical medicine. So as long as you're believing in this paradigm, you're feeding into the whole capitalist model. Back when I was, sick in my heart and in my mind and my spirit, I was a big consumer. I bought a lot of food. I was bulimic. I was a great consumer. I eat it, throw it up, and eat more. That was programmed into me. For a young woman, you have two sides held up. One is consume, and the other is be skinny. And I'm one of those people who's always trying to figure out how to reconcile extremes. It's very natural that I would just go where I went. I also like to shop, and I'm I was bummed out, go buy a new pair of shoes, right? My living under that illusion of separation and all of that turned me into a consumer. And, people who believe it. My friend who was getting them food microwaved, oh, I'm a victim of my genes. So I need all this chemical medicine to save me from my bad genes. So capitalism, the whole culture, we think that we're being educated into this sort of high ideal of knowledge, but really this is a big underlying part of it, especially when it comes to medicine and this whole sort of paradigm that they kind of keep us in. Okay, so one of the questions that I asked myself, and I was kind of struggling to put this together, I'm like, what's the point? What are we trying to get across? And so, to me, I feel like the standard model is lacking an entire and crucial dimension. This sort of concept of the interrelatedness, the underlying pattern, this sort of vibrational connected pattern reality. And it creates a limited and incorrect worldview that leads to like unnecessary suffering. Because we've got this illusion, we've got this filter of not truth. And when we add this dimension of connectivity, of that sort of underlying pattern, it takes us out of this cosmology of separation, where I'm separate from you and I'm separate from the stars, and it kind of brings it all together. It's like everything is kind of electrically connected in this whole big electromagnetic universe. It's like we're all connected, we're all one, and what I do to you affects me, and it's just, there's no separating any of that. So this is, to me, this is the paradigm that we're moving into, unity of consciousness. And it's arising despite any efforts to keep it down. It's definitely arising. It's cropping up all over the place. Not quite in academia yet. But, I am teaching a class here this fall. so it's starting.
It's here in some of us.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we got the WAM program, and a lot of that is all about this too. So it's starting. Good, okay, so any questions?